Neither of us made any effort to break the stillness, as if we both understood that whatever was unfolding between us couldn't be rushed, couldn't be defined just yet. There was an unspoken tension, a fragile energy hanging between us, thick with anticipation, and for a brief moment I wondered if that shift was something we had both subconsciously invited. My mind raced, my heart pounded erratically in my chest, and the only thought I could grasp was where this path would lead. It wasn't a matter of if, but rather when the intensity of the connection we were sharing would finally erupt. I found myself questioning the nature of this connection, wondering what it truly meant, what it would become. The sensation of wanting, needing, but also fearing it was overwhelming. The instant our hands brushed or when our gazes met, it was as though the world around us paused for a fraction of a second, just long enough for everything to feel magnified. But deep down, a small part of me already knew that the line between us had been crossed, and there was no going back to how things had been before. Whatever had shifted between us, it had irrevocably changed something fundamental. When we arrived at my apartment that evening, everything seemed suspended in time. Ethan paused by the door, his hand resting on the doorknob. The air between us was thick with something unspoken. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me as he turned to face me, his eyes intense and focused, betraying a deep longing. In that instant, I thought for a second that maybe, just maybe, he would step closer and kiss me again, as we had earlier in the night. But instead, he just smiled. It was slow and knowing, a smile that seemed to carry 1,000 unspoken words. It was a smile that made my pulse quicken, that shivered its way down my spine. His eyes held understanding and recognition, like he knew something about this moment that I wasn't fully aware of yet. "Good night," he said softly, the words slipping from his lips in a low whisper that almost sounded like a promise. There was no mistaking the significance behind it. It wasn't a casual or indifferent farewell. It was loaded with unacknowledged feelings, a farewell that felt far from final. He turned, walked inside, and shut the door softly behind him. I stood there for a moment, my mind swirling in a chaotic whirlpool of thoughts, my heart pounding in my chest. As the sound of his footsteps faded, I couldn't shake the sensation that this wasn't the end of anything. No, this was just the beginning of something that had yet to fully unfold. The morning after that night, I lay in bed wide awake, caught in a tornado of thoughts and emotions. My body was exhausted, but my mind was far from finding peace. My memories replayed with vivid clarity. The softness of his touch, the heat of his lips on mine, the raw, undeniable pull that had surged between us. It was as though everything had happened in a rush, a blur of longing and desire that left me breathless, uncertain, and deeply conflicted. The truth was, I knew what had happened was wrong. There had been lines crossed, boundaries blurred. But at the same time, I couldn't deny the deeper truth that something had shifted between us, something that couldn't be undone. The space we once shared, simple and innocent, had been irrevocably altered, and there was no going back to the way things were before. The kiss, the moment, had marked a turning point in our relationship, a point of no return. I could feel it, deep in my bones. What had been a friendship, simple and uncomplicated, had been replaced with something far more complicated, something that couldn't be defined in mere words. There was a truth there, buried beneath the layers of confusion and guilt that tangled in my chest. Ethan and I could no longer pretend that nothing had changed. We couldn't erase the memory of what had passed between us, but neither could we acknowledge it openly, not just yet. So we both wore a facade, carefully crafted, pretending that we were fine. We acted as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if we were still just friends, nothing more. We exchanged casual smiles, continued our usual conversations, as if our lives were still the same. But beneath the surface, the tension grew thicker, more palpable. It was as if there was a constant hum of electricity between us. Every glance, every touch, even the briefest of interactions felt charged. Our hearts beat in tandem, unknowingly, and each passing day only made the space between us seem larger and more fragile. Each time our hands brushed, it was as if we were standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering on the brink of something neither of us was ready to face. And the breaking point. Then one evening, everything came to a head. It wasn't planned, it wasn't anticipated, but it had been building for weeks. The house was empty. Ethan's father had left town for the weekend, and the silence in the house seemed louder than usual, almost suffocating in its quietness. I sat in the living room, mind lost in a sea of thoughts. When I heard the sound of footsteps approaching, my heart skipped a beat. I didn't need to look up to know it was him. Ethan stepped into the room, his presence commanding, as if the very air around him became heavy with an unspoken tension. He stood there for a moment, just watching me, and in his eyes I saw the same longing I had seen before, the same depth of feeling. It was as if he had been holding back, just as I had, but now, with the space and time between us, he couldn't resist it anymore. Without saying a word, he walked over to the couch, his body language confident, but still, there was a hesitation in his movements. He sat down next to me, closer than usual. The proximity of his body seemed to ignite something in me, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. The air was thick with anticipation, every tiny movement, every passing second stretching out into eternity. He was so close now, I could feel the heat of his skin, the faintest whisper of his breath against my neck. His hand, warm and steady, rested on my leg. The touch was gentle, yet there was something insistent about it, something that made my pulse quicken and my thoughts scatter. I could feel the electricity that flowed through every inch of my body. It was as if the entire room was vibrating with the energy we were both afraid to release. My heart thudded loudly in my chest, every beat punctuated by the overwhelming rush of emotions coursing through me, and as I looked into his eyes, the silent question loomed large. Could I stop this? Could I pull away, tell him to leave, end this before it went too far? But as I stared into his eyes, I realized something. The question of stopping had never been more irrelevant. There was a pull, a need that was stronger than any doubts. I could feel it in every fiber of my being. So when he leaned in closer, his lips brushing lightly against my ear, the world seemed to stop. His voice, low and thick with desire, sent a shiver down my spine as he whispered, "I want you." The point of no return. In that moment, every shred of hesitation, every ounce of self-control I had left, crumbled away. The air between us, once charged with tension, now crackled with the intensity of our shared desire. All the doubts, all the fears that had clouded my mind faded away like mist in the morning sun. There was no turning back, no more pretending, no more acting like nothing had changed. It had already happened, and now there was only the here and now, only the need to explore whatever this was between us. What followed was a blur, an intense whirlwind of passion and need that consumed us both. It was as if we had entered a new world, a place where nothing else existed except for the two of us. Our hands moved with urgency, tracing the contours of each other's bodies, memorizing every curve, every inch. Our lips met with desperation, each kiss deeper than the last, until there was nothing left but the heat, the fire, and the unrelenting pull of our desires. The world outside that room faded away. There was no past, no future, just the overwhelming intensity of the present moment. The boundaries we had once kept intact, the walls we had built around our relationship, crumbled in the wake of this undeniable connection. We knew deep down that what we were doing was wrong, that we were crossing a line that could never be uncrossed, but in that moment nothing else mattered. There was no right or wrong. There was only the desire, the connection, and the feeling of being fully alive. Aftermath and reflection. When it was finally over, when the storm of emotion and passion had settled into an uncomfortable stillness, we lay there together in silence. Our bodies were tangled, our breaths slowly returning to normal, but the air around us was thick, charged with the weight of what had just happened. We both knew that something had changed, that something irreversible had occurred. There was no going back. The innocence that had once defined our relationship was gone, replaced by something more complicated, more dangerous, and yet undeniably real. I could feel the weight of it settling in my chest, an unrelenting pressure that refused to be ignored. What now? What happened next? Would we be able to find a way to navigate this new, complicated dynamic? Could we ever go back to how things were before? Or had we crossed a line that we couldn't uncross? The uncertainty of it all made it hard to breathe, but I knew one thing for sure. My life, our lives, would never be the same again.